Remember, right, the bodhicitta is a mind, right, a heart that that cherishes others even more than oneself. That finds the suffering of others unbearable. As a kind of, for all others, right? Not just our family or friends, but equally for those who we dislike or disagree with. Holding them in complete affection and love. With kind of compassion even for that person, right, or those people. With a compassion like a mother for her only child. And then the wish to become a Buddha to benefit them, all sentient beings. With that kind of motivation in mind, then we can do the reverse of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I wanted to, we're actually up to, in the text, for those who have copies, I'm going to do, we're up to page 273, but I'm actually going to jump back just for a minute to page 271 from last time. Because people have a lot of questions about unconditioned phenomena. So I just wanted to say a few more comments about them just so people, hopefully maybe help answer the questions people had. So I'll read the quote on page 271 where he's talking, Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about sometimes they call them unconditioned. There are many different synonyms. Unconditioned or non-compounded. There's another one, non-product or non-functioning things. Anyway, there are different synonyms, different translations, I guess. But he lists them here. He says, once compounded phenomena, persons and phenomena have thus been established as not truly existent by way of the reasonings explained earlier. Now it says, it is established with little difficulty that uncompounded phenomena, and then he lists four: space, analytical cessations, non-analytical cessations, and suchness. And he says that they also do not truly exist. So he lists four uncompounded phenomena there, right? Space, analytical cessations, non-analytical cessations, and suchness, meaning emptiness. Anyway, Lama Tsongkhapa in this text doesn't go into great detail about what those are. He's assuming that his audience already knows that, so he's talking about the emptiness for those phenomena. But I just thought, since people had questions, let's take a couple quick comments. Those are covered in detail, actually, in a number of places. I brought mostly in the Abhidharma literature. So actually, I was like, okay, I'll look back at that. So this is Chim Jampayang's commentary to Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosha, and this is actually Art Engel, a wonderful translator. His translation of Vasubandhu's summary of the 5 skandhas. But actually, the unconditioned phenomena are not included in the 5 skandhas, just to be clear, because the 5 skandhas are, you know what those are. I won't go into that. That'll be a whole other topic. These are part of, they sometimes called the bases. Like so objects of knowledge. In other words, they're in the list of objects of knowledge, the unconditioned phenomena. And in Abhidharma, that's where that comes from, that list of 4. So in the Abhidharma literature, traditionally, as Vasubandhu points out, those 4 phenomena are listed as the most important examples, you could say, of unconditioned phenomena. And so here in this commentary, he asked the question, the author asked the question, what are unconditioned phenomena? And then he lists the same ones, space and the 2 cessations, and here he lists space, actually here he lists 3, space and 2 cessations, here he lists space, 2 cessations, and suchness. So those are what unconditioned phenomena are. And what would this say here? Read you. First I'll read this. This is what I said last time, I'm just going to point it out. This is a book conceived and introduced by His Holiness Dalai Lama and translated by Thupten Jinpa, a book called Science and Philosophy in the Indian Buddhist Classics. And so he makes the same point here that I made last time, where he says, Buddhists in addition have the further category of unconditioned phenomena, which is essentially the absence or negation of conditioned things. Does that make sense? So a conditioned phenomena is an object of knowledge, which is, as he's saying here, is the absence of some conditioned phenomena. Not all, not necessarily all conditioned phenomena, but specific conditioned phenomena. So that's how he defines unconditioned phenomena in general. And then we go through these examples. And I just thought just because people ask, I'm actually going to read this from Art Engel's translation of Vasubandhu's text. So I'll just go through what are they, right? So he says here, first in general, he says, the essential nature of an unconditioned entity is that it does not depend upon causes and conditions. And then he says, the root text of the Abhidharma presents their classification as consisting of space, non-analytical cessations, analytical cessations, and suchness, the same list that Tsongkhapa. So that's where he's taking that from, is obviously the point. Right? So there, in one text, it was what we said, an absence of conditioned phenomena. Here he says, not dependent upon causes and conditions, this definition, right? And then he goes through those 4. So, and this is interesting, he says, and there are different definitions that are given in these different texts, but I'll go through first space, right? So he defines, and this is interesting, he says, what is the essential nature or the nature of space? And then he gives different definitions, 2 different ones. One is a lack of obstructedness, that's the one I gave last time, right? A lack of obstruction, or a place for form. So that's an interesting definition. And one point that he makes here is that he says, even when there's form present, it's present in space, right? So you could say, like, and sometimes they give this example of a cup, right? If you have a cup, there's empty space inside the cup, right? Otherwise it's not a cup, is it? And then when we pour, say, I don't know, coffee into it or something, right? Then you say, actually the space is still there, now the space is occupied by coffee, right? Then if you drink all the coffee, then again, it's, there's space. But it's still space. So it's space when there's stuff present, and there's space when there's stuff not present. And they would say, oh, the stuff couldn't be present if it weren't for the space in which the stuff is present. So I was just, last time I was saying that's a bit different. Sometimes we talk, like in, I mean, actually, I was thinking about it, I was like, wow, I don't even, like, there are so many different, like, I'm a bit, to be honest, I was like, people were asking about that in relation to science, and I was sitting there going, well, what's the difference? I don't know. Like, I remember when I was in school, you studied, like, Newton said space in the context of Newton, but I was like, then Einstein's description of space is quite different than Newton's, and then I don't even know the description of space from a subatomic, like, for people after Einstein's time, how did they define space? I was like, I have no idea, actually. So this is the Buddhist definition of space. So you can compare it. I guess my point, I just want to read that because people were asking, so now, if you want to think about some particular scientific definition of space from a certain, so what I was realizing is there isn't just one scientific definition of space. That's what I was sort of referring to. People were asking about that. I was like, well, it depends which level of analysis from a scientific point of view you're looking at it from, right? An astronomer would be different than a Newtonian physicist, which would be different than there's a word Einsteinian, is there? Which would be different than more current theories. So anyway, regardless, that's the definition from a Buddhist perspective. You can now compare and contrast for yourself. Does that make sense? Then I'm going to jump ahead. So, and then analyticals, here's another one. In this text, he defines it as space is that which is free from obstructive resistance and accommodates physical objects. So here he combines the two parts, right? Those two phrases from the previous text in one sentence. And then analytical cessations. Again, I kind of went over this last time. I just wanted to give more precise, detailed information in case people are curious. So analytical cessations, he defines as, the definition of an analytical cessation is freedom from contaminated objects of negation obtained by the power of uncontaminated wisdom included in the uninterrupted path. Is that clear?
Yeah. We can spend the rest of the day on that one.
Yeah, we could. Or here, I'll give you another definition here in this text. It says, with regard to the question, what is an analytical cessation? Analysis is a form of tranquil consideration and a particular type of wisdom, namely that of the uninterrupted path. Analytical cessation is that which is achieved by this type of analysis. Yeah, so that's clear. That's clear? I don't know. I'll just say briefly what that means. So an uninterrupted path, he goes through a lot, these texts go through a lot of detail about this. And what they're getting at is this, uninterrupted path is referring to a particular state. Up until, let's see if I say this right, we all meditate on emptiness, right? This is what we're getting at here. Anybody who studied emptiness can meditate on it. But there comes a point, which is on the 5 paths, it's called on the path of seeing, where one realizes emptiness directly. Right? And so on the path of seeing and the path of meditation, one has a direct realization of emptiness. No longer, means it's like non-conceptual and completely direct. So the uninterrupted path is you could say, is the experience of a person who's in the state of directly perceiving emptiness. Does that make sense? Not indirectly. It's not conceptual. It's through their analysis they reach a point where they directly perceive emptiness in a state of calm abiding meditation. So they're in calm abiding meditation, and their mind is completely absorbed in the experience of emptiness, like water poured into water. That's the traditional example given. So the uninterrupted path is when the person's in that direct perception. And what the definition is saying is, through the power of that direct experience of the uninterrupted path, realizing emptiness, one, and how does he say it here? One achieves a freedom from contaminated object of negation. What that means is, and so they give an example on the path, when one achieves the uninterrupted path of the path of seeing, while in that experience they say one abandons or has a cessation of the objects to be negated or ceased through the path of seeing. And so I'll give you an example of that. There's an example like, up until the path of seeing, a person can still have, what's the word, like wrong intellectual concepts of emptiness. One can have these kind of like wrong views, you could call it. But once one has seen emptiness directly on the path of seeing, one can no longer give rise to those extreme views. It becomes impossible because you've seen it, right? So then your mind won't be able to give rise to those. So while the person is having this direct realization of emptiness, they say there's a cessation of the ability to any longer give rise to actually believe a wrong view. I'm just giving that as an example. So that would be an example of an analytic cessation.
You use the word while, but that experience is permanent. I mean, it's forever from that point on, is it not, or not?
No, because then the person, the person who's a person on the path of seeing who's in a direct experience of emptiness, they call it the uninterrupted path, and then they sometimes have a translation, they say the path of subsequent attainment or something like that. So the person's in the uninterrupted path where they're directly perceiving emptiness, like water poured into water, no conventional objects are appearing to their consciousness, only emptiness is appearing, like water poured into water. And then there's Bob Thurman calls it the aftermath samadhi, but I think most people translate it something like subsequent attainment. And that's where the person arises from that concentration state, right? The bodhisattva, let's say, arises in that concentration state, and then they again see their cup of tea, and the Buddha's Hatanka, their friend. So that's a different state of, that's a totally different state, right? But when they reach that new state, they won't be able, whatever objects of cessation they've ceased at that point won't arise for them. They'll actually be quite different when they arise from that particular one. So it's two different, so they call it like the state of the uninterrupted path is that direct perception, and then there's this subsequent attainment where one looks around and interacts, and again, objects appear, and they appear in a dualistic form. That, one is no longer directly perceiving emptiness at that time. So it's two different states. And so he's saying here, these analytical cessations, how does he say it? Let's see, go through this one. Freedom from contaminated object of negation obtained by the power of the uncontaminated wisdom included the uninterrupted path, right? So through the power of that experience of direct perception of emptiness, there's the non-arising of certain, what does he say? Of certain contaminated objects, right? So certain contaminated things, the ability to experience them ceases due to the power of that, and that's an analytical cessation. So the stopping of the ability to give rise to, or the possibility of giving rise to certain afflicted states of mind.
But am I not doing that? But don't I achieve that based on causes and conditions? So
And
it
yeah, it's
depends.
interesting. It's a very good question, right? It's something I think about a lot with this one, and it's an interesting question, isn't it? And I guess one has to analyze actually. So, because that's going back, right? You said, I said, the definition, right, was that which is not arisen due to that doesn't come about due to causes and conditions, right? And actually, these texts go into detail about your question because other people have asked it. I guess going back in history. And I guess one has to kind of analyze. One has to kind of. This is why I said this a little bit last time, but one has to think about. To answer that question, one has to think: what does it mean cause, and what does it mean condition, right? Like, and one has to so a cause. The principal cause of a thing, he uses the example of seed, right? So the principal cause of an oak tree is the seed of an oak tree, right? And then under the proper conditions, that seed, which is the cause, will give rise to the effect, which is a tree, right? And the principal cause, the same way, right? The principal cause of a human body, right, is the meeting of the sperm and the egg, right? And so on. And then the conditions are all the womb and so on. Right, so, and you could say, so what is the principal cause? It's the main thing, first of all, without which the effect won't come about, and that's of a similar type to the effect. Does that make sense? Like, so an oak tree seed, an oak seed, right, is of a similar type to an oak tree, right? And it's the principal cause, and then and without it, you'll never get an oak tree, and so on. And the same thing with the human body, right? Like the DNA of the sperm and egg having met is similar to the, and even the cell is similar to the kind of cell that human cells have, right? There are human cells actually, aren't they? And then it gives rise. And so here, the point is that there's no such cause like that, right? Because it's something that's not going to arise, right? Like, so in other words, if you say, like, let's say a wrong view, right? So first of all, the wrong view will not arise, right? It's not, in other words, the definition of a cessation, as I said, is a negative, right? So that afflictive emotion, or that, in this case, a wrong view, for example, will not arise. And there's not, actually, really, if you analyze what is a cessation, or this cessation, it's the lack of a cause that's going to give rise to a result. You see what I mean? Like, there is so there's not there's not a cause there that's going to give rise to a result. If you actually analyze it, you see, it's the lack of a cause, and therefore the result won't come about. So that's what they mean by no cause. It's not arisen due to causes and conditions.
I still don't get that. So then how did it happen?
And you could say it happened because the cause, right? What happened? It's actually interesting, isn't it? So the uninterrupted path, right?
Cessation of mental afflictions or something?
You're eliminating, right?
Eliminated a cause, didn't it?
But doesn't this also say that the causes don't even exist? At least the way I read, what you read earlier at the very start, was that basically all these phenomena don't truly exist.
Oh, yeah, but that is different though, because in other words, conditioned phenomena, in that sense, he's talking about emptiness there. So in the sense of emptiness, right, conditioned phenomena also don't truly exist. Right? Your body also doesn't truly
Right.
exist. So in that sense, so then you would have to say, if it was just that fact, then you would have to say, well, conditioned phenomena are unconditioned. Because your body does have causes and conditions, but it's also empty of inherent arising.
Right.
But these phenomena are unconditioned. They're still, he's making two different points. One, the point in the text that you read just now is that conditioned phenomena and unconditioned phenomena are both empty. That makes sense, right? I'm just saying, what is a condition? So one point is they're both emptiness. That's true. Well, empty, rather. That's true. Here I'm just raising the question, what is the definition of this unconditioned? People were asking that last time. And so I'm just raising the question, well, what's the definition, though, of an unconditioned phenomenon? And so I'm just reading how they define it, which is different than its emptiness, right? First you have to define what is that phenomena, and then you can prove that it's empty. So here I'm just defining what is that phenomena, so then we can show that it's also empty, as you said.
It's a building block forward, almost.
In a way, although, you mean in terms of why I'm explaining this?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
You need
Yeah.
to have that to get to the next part.
Yeah, if you don't understand what it is, then how can you analyze its emptiness?
Right.
You know, they sometimes say that, right? We have to understand, actually later Lama Tsongkhapa will say that in this text, basically that you have to understand conventional phenomena in order to understand ultimate truth. You have to understand conventional truth in order to understand ultimate truth. You can't nobody can start by understanding ultimate truth. Because you have to start by understanding what is a conventional phenomena, and then if you analyze deeply enough, you realize, well, the nature of that conventional phenomena is its ultimate truth. So you have to first understand what's the conventional phenomenon. So that's why I was just going over this in case people didn't know these definitions. So, and actually, I'll read it one more time. It's right. Analytical cessation is an instance of an unconditioned, permanent, virtuous substance. Virtuous phenomena is a better way to put that for us. Its definition is freedom from contaminated objects of negation, or for just say contaminated objects of negation, obtained by the power of an uncontaminated wisdom included in the uninterrupted path. That is obtained by separation, or by the power of the antidote, completely impeding the arising of the object of negation. So this is getting at what you were asking, Paul. So what he's saying here, I'll just read that last sentence again. So how is it obtained? Because that's what you're asking. How does it arise, right? And so this is Chim Jampa. His is considered to be the most definitive commentary by a Tibetan on Abhidharma. That's what it's good to use. So it said, or one of the most useful, something like that, or important. So he says, how is this analytical cessation attained? That was your question. So I probably shouldn't add to it because I don't really know, but Chimpa Jampa does it. So he says, it is obtained by separation, like cutting off or separating, or by the power of the antidote. This is what you were getting at, I think, which completely impedes the arising of that object of negation. Okay. So it's like, so it's an antidote that impedes the arising of whichever, in this case, afflicted phenomena, right? So it means a mental affliction, a form of ignorance, a kind of wrong view, and that those things, how does he say it, are completely separated from, or completely cut off, or completely, an antidote's completely been applied. And the point here is for it to be a cessation is that that particular affliction will never arise again.
So is it kind of like attaining Buddhahood from that point on? It's it had a beginning but it has no end?
Say what you mean by it. Because that person, Buddhahood, the state of Buddhahood has achieved all the cessations. But the person on the path of seeing is on their way to Buddhahood, but it has certain cessations, but there are many more cessations to go.
I'm just asking if it's similar in that there's a starting point, so to speak, but there's no ending point.
Yeah, that's right.
So
In
like on analytical cessation, you mean like on the mind you can still like project, right, on the mind, but on the external object you can't project anything.
I'm not sure I understand.
Let's say like the analytical cessation, let's say like is a separation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's still something separation from what? From mind and the object, right?
Oh, no. In this case, it's just like when he says separation or antidote, what he means is that say it. How does he say it? Obtained a separation. That is obtained by a separation. If I leave out the second clause, a separation which completely impedes the arising of the objectification. So what he's saying is it's separated from the cause of that particular affliction, so that will never arise again.
Yeah, but the mind is still there, though, right?
Yeah. It's not negating the mind. Exactly. Yeah. That's correct. All right, and then should I briefly go over the other? Is this helpful? Should I go over the other two? Okay. I'll use this. So a non-analytical, the third of the four, right? I'm doing it, actually it's interesting. In this text, he switches the order of two of them, but I'm going to go in the order Lama Tsongkhapa used. So next would be a non-analytical cessation. Anyway, I'm going to jump down to the actual definition. So he says, what is it? Right, so he's going through, he's doing a little bit of etymology, so I'm going to skip the etymology. We don't need the Sanskrit etymology, I don't think, for our purposes here. But he says, so a non-analytical cessation, what is it? Then he says, an insufficiency of necessary conditions. That is, the non-analytical cessation is the condition by which future entities are permanently obstructed from arising due to an insufficiency of necessary conditions. And so there, it's similar to an analytical cessation in the sense that it's a permanent. Yeah, excuse permanent. But it's permanent, but also like from that point forward, a certain thing won't arise, and it's also a mental, afflicted phenomena won't arise. But here, the difference is, right, in the earlier one, when I said analytical cessation, it's arising due to the power of wisdom, right? We said that, the wisdom of the uninterrupted path. Here, it's a similar non-arising of something, but it's not directly because of the uninterrupted path of wisdom, so that's why it's non-analytical. Does that make sense? Instead, it's that thing won't arise due to why? An insufficiency of necessary conditions. Does that make sense? So here, it's similar in the sense that something afflicted won't arise in the future, but the cause is not analytical, it's a non-analytical cause, which is that certain conditions, as he puts it, are no longer present, and therefore the result won't arise. And again, those are, and really this is getting at aspects, let's make a quick point. Part of, these are all experiences of Arya beings, which are beings who have seen emptiness directly. So he's talking about there are other ways in which Arya beings experience cessations than the uninterrupted path. And one of them is a lack of certain conditions that happen in there for them. There's no way to put this. So it's something that happens for beings who are having cessations, which are beings on the Arya paths. Means beings who have seen emptiness directly and are progressing to enlightenment. And then the last one is suchness. And I'll just read the definition. This one we've been studying, so you kind of know this one, right? But he says, what is suchness? Right? And here, Vasubandhu's answer is, it is the true nature of entities and the insubstantiality of those entities. Right, and then he's pointing out, entities are existent phenomena. Right? He goes on to explain. Entities are existent phenomena. Their true nature, and he said, actually, how does he say it here? Suchness is their nature as it truly is, their ultimate mode of being. That's big. Right, that's what we've been studying all this time. Okay, so I just wanted to, that's just a brief, what's the word? I just wanted to kind of give people some definitions because I think it's pretty similar to what we said last time, but there's a little more detail in case I know people were curious about that.
Would it help to also think, again, in etymological terms, the etymology of the word analysis and the verb to analyze from Greek, which means to separate, actually, because you're talking about separation there.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. To separate things, to analyze them, so that you achieve cessation by means of analysis.
That's interesting, first of all. And it's an interesting idea, isn't it, too? Like, here, in this particular, because there are many types of analysis in Buddhism, aren't there? For one point, you know. But here, what they're talking about is interesting, because, just related to what you're saying, because, you know, actually, if you think about Buddhist practice in general, there are almost like countless forms of analysis. But here it's referring to a very specific kind of analysis, right? Which is this ultimate analysis that we've been doing, these reasonings that we're studying about emptiness, right? And so here the person has done this kind of ultimate analysis of the nature of emptiness, right? And they've realized emptiness. And then at this point, for an analytical cessation, that person, it's actually quite interesting, isn't it? Their analysis has led to a state beyond analysis. Because that person, when they reach a point of direct perception of emptiness, it's non-conceptual. Right? It's completely direct. It's completely like water poured into water. It's completely naked. It's completely direct. It's completely, their mind is completely absorbed. And so it's an interesting state, isn't it? So in other words, it's like, yeah, their analysis has eventually taken them to understanding, first a conceptual, intellectual understanding of emptiness, and then to understanding emptiness that's beyond concept. So in a sense, yeah, it's interesting. You could say their analysis has even separated them from analysis, in a way. At that point, it separated them from any kind of conceptuality. Anyway.
That's where wisdom comes in.
Yeah, and actually, I'll say this too. It's interesting because there are three types. You know, Buddhism, there are other, but sometimes there's this list of 3 types of wisdom, right? So the first one is the wisdom of study or listening, they call it, right? Which is what we're doing actually. We're studying, right? And there's a kind of wisdom that comes from that, which is obviously intellectual, isn't it? And actually, it's quite interesting that what they sometimes differ. I just think this is fascinating. They sometimes I was studying this because I was like, well, what does that mean? Like, where's the difference between the wisdom? There are 3, right? The wisdom of study or listening, the wisdom of contemplation, and the wisdom arisen through meditation. And they sometimes say the wisdom of listening. Actually, if you've been with like great lamas or something, you sometimes have this experience, right, where like you really get something, but it's through the power of someone else. You know, like it's like you're reading a book and you get an idea. Like you really like. I had that experience yesterday. I was reading a book and I was like, wow. And then as soon as I shut the book, I was like, what did he say? Like it was like, you know, I was like, oh, I totally get that. Then I'm like, you know, I had to like I have to go back and like, I was like, I should write this down or something. Like, you know, so it's like, it's a kind of wisdom that's intellectually acquired, that's an analysis, right? But it's mainly through the power. It's mainly through the power of the author or the speaker, right? And oneself is listening or reading, and sort of beginning to become familiar with something. So it is a kind of wisdom, right? But it's not yet through the power of one's own analysis in a way. One is sort of following along. Then there's the wisdom of contemplation is arisen through the power of your own analysis, right? You're sitting and contemplating, or walking if you want, and contemplating, and you're thinking deeply, and then you have a kind of insight, right? A correct insight, and that's a different kind of wisdom, isn't it? It's the wisdom that's arisen through contemplation, or contemplative meditation, or your own analysis, in other words. And then the wisdom arisen through meditation, and there, you know, kind of it depends upon that previous one. Does that make sense? But then you meditate on that until you gain, and what's the difference in a way, right? Actually, we all know that, don't we? Like, there are many, I'm not just going to give a mundane point about this, but there are a lot of things that, like, I could think about and have an insight about, but it doesn't change my behavior, does it? Like, the first time I think about a certain thing and think, oh, I should really be better about this, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm suddenly better about it, does it? Right? There's a depth of insight that leads to a kind of deeper transformation, right? And meditation is where you already have the analytical understanding, but now you're, what's the word? You're familiarizing your mind. Meditation means familiarizing, right? You're familiarizing your mind with it more and more deeply until you come to various points, right, where that becomes transformative, right? That knowledge that arose through correct analysis starts to become familiar to you, starts to become your way of relating to yourself and the world, starts to become, you know, that through which your reactions to things, you know, before your reactions were based on some other understanding. You know, we've all had that experience, don't we, where we have some correct insight, but our reactions to people is still based on this other, less enlightened understanding, maybe. And that's because we haven't meditated, right, enough. We have an understanding that's intellectual, but I always liked Pabonkarum, this made me laugh the first time I read it, where he says in The Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand, he says, he uses this analogy, he says, he's like a bad cook, like who makes a soup and everything's floating on the top. You know, and the soup doesn't have any flavor because all the ingredients are just like, it's not really cooked, you know. And so there's like a bunch of ingredients there floating and then there's water. And he's like, that's not really soup, is it? But he says like, soup has to be like, what's the word? It all sinks down and it flavors the water and then the soup has flavor, right? It all integrates, you know. And he's like, and he's making this point, he says like, the first one, the water with floaties on it, floating stuff on, that's like the person, that's like us if we haven't meditated, right? Like all the stuff's floating on, you know, floating up here, right? It hasn't gotten to here. I mean, it's a spatial metaphor also, isn't it? It's floating on the top, but it hasn't sunk down. And I just like, I found that metaphor useful for me personally, because I was like, oh wow, that's a danger, isn't it? Where like you get the idea, but if you don't meditate on it, it doesn't get, what's the word, infused? You know, familiarized. This process of meditation is a familiarization that lets things sink in. We say that, don't we? Oh, then it really sunk in. You know, I had this insight, then the insight sunk in. But the sinking in is through meditation, it's through familiarization, right? And the deepest level of familiarization is this uninterrupted path. You know, that's extremely profound, but we can all do our own, we don't have to be at that level if you're not calm lighting and so on. But all of us, through familiarizing with something, it infuses us more, doesn't it? And we become more qualified by it, or more, you know what I mean, right? Like I remember having that insight. I'll just share this really old person. I remember that one time because I was like, I was thinking about bodhicitta actually, and then one time I remember I was with, I was just like hanging out with Riba Rinpoche, who was one of Lama Tsongkhapa's gurus. This picture up there. He's passed away now. His reincarnations in India. But I remember that I just had that insight. I was watching him and I thought he was just like he was like eating sampa. You know sampa, like Tibetan flour. It's like it's called barley flour, roasted barley flour. He was making pak, where you take it and you throw it in your butter tea, and then you make it into a little shape, and then you eat it. And I was just watching him do that. We were hanging out, and I was watching him do that, and I thought, wow, his bodhicitta while eating pak is more powerful than like, you know, more powerful than mine is when I'm meditating, but it's more powerful. I was like, it's more powerful than my experience of 100 people. If I was sitting around with 100 people meditating on compassion, it wouldn't be as powerful as his is when he's eating, you know, something like that. Because he had meditated, right? He had the power of bodhicitta arisen through meditation, right? Like I might have, we might have it, all of us. If you sit and meditate long enough, you can have it through your contemplation, where you have some understanding of bodhicitta. Like you're like, oh wow, you know. But then if it hasn't gotten really cooked into you, right? Then you get up and then somebody says something annoying and you roll your eyes at them. Whereas for him, he had meditated on it, right? Enough so that actually I had that experience that even one time, I remember he fell down. And even as he was falling, he had bodhicitta. Later, his comment showed that, you know, when he was on medication and he was like, he had a hallucination, it was with bodhicitta. Like it was some kind of, they had given him something for a surgery and he had a kind of, like some kind of thing. But he had bodhicitta regard, like in other words, it was that deep in his being that even when he was unconscious, even when he was, bodhicitta was always there. But, you know, we all have something that we're familiar with, even when we're, like, it's not bodhicitta, unfortunately, right? Ours might be anger, for example, or fear, or, you know, that'll arise even when you're barely conscious, even when you're, but that was what struck me. I was like, oh, if you become somebody who's really meditated on bodhicitta, for example, or emptiness, or whatever, if you meditate deeply enough on it, then, right, it gets like that, like the soup, right? Where it's infusing all parts of the person. Does that make sense? Even, you know, and even their dreams. That's what they say. Right? Even in the person, like somebody who's meditated enough on bodhicitta, even their dreams are bodhicitta, have bodhicitta. Because it's in their unconscious, you could say for a second. Buddhists wouldn't say that. They call them, so they can't help it. But right, it's so deep in their being. Anyway. Okay, so let's go back to the text now where we actually left off. Oh, sorry.
When a person really realized emptiness, so that means that there will be no more mental affliction, no attachment, no delusion. But because you already have realized the true ultimate peace.
It's a good question. Like, so according to, let's see if I say this right. Because you said once a person's really realized emptiness, right? So I'll go through. One time I was actually, I'll share. I was asking. You may Kinstrom that question in a way. I was asking about that to him, and he made a point. He said, if a person gains what they call a correct inferential cognition of emptiness, I'm not talking, so not the direct realization, but like a correct inference, where the person through their own so the wisdom arisen from contemplation. So a person goes and contemplates and creates merit and purifies and keeps contemplating. The first you could say true realization of emptiness is conceptual. So I was saying to Ken Termishi, so when that person has that experience, where they correctly inferentially cognize emptiness, but it's arisen through the power of contemplation. And I said, what happens? Because the person still has mental afflictions, right? And he said, oh yeah, they still have mental afflictions. And he says, but for that person, the mental afflictions already become so weak. Like they still have their mental afflictions, but it seems like silly to them. They no longer have what's what I say, right? Because they have this correct understanding of emptiness, he said it's like it becomes so much lighter. They become so much more peaceful. They can still have a mental affliction if something happens because of their past habits, but it's like, what's it say, right? They intellectually know it's not real, and so they let it go very quickly. Then, if you continue on the path, right, there comes a point where I was saying on the path of seeing, where the person directly cognizes emptiness. At that point, they actually experience certain cessations, which are what we're talking about, analytical cessations. Right? And so then certain mental afflictions actually stop, but not all yet. But at that point, they say the mental afflictions are so weak that what's it say, right? They're not completely gone yet. Some of them are. Some are. They start having these cessations of more and more as they progress along the bhumis of the path, and it's so for that person, the mental affliction is so weak that they don't even take rebirth due to the power of mental afflictions. They take their rebirth due to the power of compassion, but they still have subtle mental afflictions, you could say. And then it's only at the 8th bhumi, for bodhisattvas, it's at the 8th bhumi, when the bodhisattva achieves the 8th of the 10 bhumis, then they completely have no mental afflictions at all. Like absolutely none. All the mental afflictions have completely ceased at the 8th bhumi. So from the 1st bhumi to the 8th bhumi, they're gradually abandoning more and more subtle, or having cessations, you could say, of more and more subtle mental afflictions, but they don't control the person anymore. That's one way to put it. Their antidote is so strong that the mental afflictions can't control that person, but they only gradually have completely eliminate them. Okay, now we'll jump forward to page 273, where we actually left off. So that was a long side thing. Well, people said it was useful, so it's good. And actually, I'm going to read the headline, what is that? The header, the outline heading to this one. Because we left off in a section, right, where Lama Tsongkhapa was pointing out, that is, when the correct meaning of emptiness is where you correctly identify the object of negation, which is inherent existence, or we'll call it inherent existence, and you refute that through reasoning, right? And then he was saying there are other people who I wrote down here, blah blah blah, like who make up their own theories of emptiness that are nihilistic, and he was saying those are not at all the same, right? And we have to be able to. And he was making this point. He was saying, be careful, because sometimes the words will, Buddhists who will make up nihilistic theories of emptiness will use, of course they're Buddhists, so they'll use the same words, right? They'll read some, and it's not, a lot of times, it's not that they're malicious, they just don't know, like they misunderstood the teachings, right? So they'll use the words of Nagarjuna or Chandrakirti or whoever, but they'll use them incorrectly, they don't have the correct meaning, right? So when it says like things, when it says there's no form, for example, that person will say, oh, there's really no form doesn't exist at all, right? Whereas we're saying, no, form exists conventionally, and its ultimate nature is it lacks inherent existence, for example, right? That's a very subtle distinction, and he's saying we have to understand those distinctions. We had left off at this point last time, where he was saying, how do you say it? He said, if emptiness of an inherently established own entity were the absence of a thing in and of itself, like, so he's saying, there, I just want to make clear what he's saying. He's saying, if you were to say, like, the emptiness of a chair is that a chair is empty of being a chair, right? He would say, if you assert that's what emptiness means, then the absence in it would mean that nothing could possibly exist at all, right? But you're all sitting on chairs, so that's quite unreasonable, isn't it? And then he's saying, so the holder of this thesis, anyway, he goes on, let's say here, therefore the basis for how he says it. He says this is a random statement without any investigation. That's my point. He's saying if somebody asserts things are just empty of, like a chair is empty of being a chair, that's at the bottom of 272. Then he's saying, well, then that's nihilistic, right? And it makes no sense, does it? It's not. He's saying it's blithering nonsense or blah blah blah. That's why I wrote blah blah blah. It's like that. Right? So now he's saying. Now he goes into another detail here. So he says, I'm on the top of 273 now, where we're actually picking up. He says, with good insight into the implications of this way of reasoning, all Buddhist schools of the country of Aryas. Actually, what's the country of Aryas? India. Yeah. Right. It's his respect, right? Actually, Lama Tsongkhapa is paying respect, which he does over and over for the source. Right? What's the source of all the Buddhist teachings? Where the and here's what His Holiness says. Actually, His Holiness often says, "I'm a follower of the tradition of Nalanda," right? Nalanda Monastic University, which is kind of near Bodh Gaya. It's not far from Bodh Gaya. And he's saying, the great Aryas are, and it's the masters of that, right? That's a copy of the one all the way on the corner there. Not this. This is the Lama Tsongkhapa, but that one. It's a tanka. It's a copy of a tanka that His Holiness Dalai Lama gave to Gyume Khenche Rinpoche. I was there in Connecticut. I was there when he gave it, actually. And it's a picture of Shakyamuni Buddha surrounded by the 17 pandits of Nalanda. So the 17 great teachers of Nalanda Monastic University. Because His Holiness Dalai Lama often says, I'm a student of them. I'm the follower of that tradition.
Didn't he have that made like 3 or 4 years ago, actually? He had that commission?
His Holiness did. I think
Yeah.
he had certain copies that he gave them out.
Yeah, because I saw it actually, supposedly he had the original with him. I guess I saw it in Latvia that he brought it with him, and that's what he was saying, that's what this is if you're curious.
Yeah.
That's what I remember hearing that story.
And actually, that's an innovation, personally. I would share that. I think it's quite touching. To me personally, it's touching. That's actually an innovation of His Holiness Dalai Lama himself, really. Like, there wasn't a list of 17s before. They're all known Buddhist teachers. They're famous Buddhist teachers. But they were like, sometimes they were called, what is it? The 6 ornaments and the 2 precious ones or something, right? So there was that list. But I think His Holiness correctly, really wonderfully said, well, wait a second, we're leaving out Bhava Viveka. We're leaving out some of these great masters. And he was saying, we need to study all of those great teachers. And so he created a longer list, just as a way of encouraging people to study their works, actually. Because he was always saying, right, if you don't study the works of the great Nalanda Pandits, then you're not really understanding the essence of Mahayana Buddhism. So anyway, it's quite beautiful. So here he's saying, so that's all. So country of Aryas means the country where Buddhism came from, right? The country of the great teachers of the past. He says, and then he's making, actually, I'll just kind of describe this. One thing he's saying is, right, schools, other Buddhist schools, they call them, how does he say it, proponents of things, right? Here he says, propound true existence of phenomena and are called proponents of things. So one point he's making here is that schools that don't follow the Majjhimaka, right, there are many, like the mind-only school, the first one's the Vaibhashika, the Satantrika, the Chittamatra, the mind-only. From a perspective of Majjhimaka, we sometimes call them, different translators use different terms, like proponents of things, proponents of true existence. One translator was saying realists. I don't really like that term because then a realist who's unrealistic doesn't really make sense. So I don't like that. I don't like that translation myself. But proponent of true existence seems like that's what does he say here? Proponent of things or proponent of true existence. That's, I think, a clear explanation. So one point he's making is that there are Buddhist schools that propound true existence, right? All those lower schools, and so he's making a couple of points here. One is we respect those teachers, right? We respect those traditions. They're Buddhist traditions, actually, of philosophy, but they don't get at the actual meaning of emptiness. So then he says, propounding that things are without true existence, and no more asserting any phenomena whatsoever to be established as truly existent would seem to be a sign of distinct superiority over others, or over those of the other factions. So he's saying, you know, those who propound the Prasangika view are superior philosophers, right? I mean, they're superior in their explanation of emptiness. So that's what he's saying there. Then he goes, so that's one point. So you see the point there. So he's saying there are Buddhist schools that propound true existence. Those are actual Buddhist schools, right? Then there are those in the Madhyamaka school who say things lack true existence. That's the superior or the ultimate intent of the Buddha, the ultimate position on emptiness. And then he makes a point here. He said, I'm going to read this last paragraph. I'll read part of it. Not asserting true, he says, this is because of the two. Not asserting true existence with regard to any things or phenomena, having refuted true existence with regard to phenomena by reasoning. And then he's contrasting that with propounding that all things and phenomena are without true existence, dependence upon a nihilistic emptiness. Are mistaken, that's a mistaken. So here, what he's really getting at is this. Is he's saying, you know, there are wonderful Buddhist teachers who propounded that things do truly exist. Right? Actually, I was just reading Vasubandhu, right? His Abhidharma. He's a proponent of true existence. Like, in other words, he's a great Buddhist, one of the great Buddhist philosophers. He's among the 17 great pandits of Nalanda. He's among the 6 ornaments, they sometimes call him. You know, everybody respects him as one of the greatest Buddhist masters in history. And he's considered to be a proponent of true existence. He didn't teach Prasangika, Madhyamaka perspective. And so one point Lama Tsongkhapa is making is he's saying, you know, those are wonderful philosophers, right? Buddhist philosophers. They're great upholders of the Buddhist tradition. And then if you look at the position of Buddha, Palada, and Chandrakirti, Nagarjuna, they're superior even. They're the best among all. They're like the cream of the crop, whatever. They're the best of all Buddhist philosophers because they propound that things don't inherently or truly exist. But then he's saying, then there are other people who claim to be Madhyamakas, who also say things don't truly exist, but they mean they don't exist. They mean things don't exist at all. And then he's making a point. He's saying, first of all, and he says these are disreputable in all respects. What he's really saying is, that's not any Buddhist position actually. Like, that's not in accord with the highest position of Buddhist philosophy, and it's also not in accord with a lower philosophical tenet system. That's not in accord with any Buddhist perspective because the Buddha never taught a nihilistic perspective. Does that make sense? So so it's actually an interesting point he's making, isn't it? That a person could say, oh, I'm a Madhyamaka philosopher, but if what they're propounding is that, how does he say it here? All things and phenomena are without true existence, it depends upon a nihilistic emptiness. Right? If that's their position, then he's saying then, although they are claiming to be a Madhyamaka, you could say, actually, it's not at all similar to any Buddhist. So the Madhyamaka position, or actually any of the other Buddhist positions, it's not a Buddhist worldview. And it's not a correct worldview either, is his point. Does that make sense, kind of? So, and he's saying that because, and actually I think it's an important point. One is, you could sort of say, oh, well, it could be some other person. But actually it could be oneself. So one has to be careful of that because, I mean, if somebody else has that philosophical position, that's their business in a way. The danger is if you misunderstand emptiness yourself and you come to some conclusion, oh, like emptiness, like we said last time, as if emptiness is this truly existent thing and all other things are an emptiness, so therefore they don't exist. But emptiness is real, right? That's nihilism, isn't it? That you're denigrating all the phenomena, all conventional phenomena. That's nihilism, and we ourselves could fall into that. He says that would fall off the cliff into that. Last time, his metaphor, right? And so he's saying here, if you start to get close to that position in your own, because this could happen to us, right? Say you're sitting there contemplating, then he's saying, be careful, because in our own if other philosophers, I mean, the people who got this wrong in Tibetan history, sometimes I think oh, they were so knowledgeable actually. Like, some of them were great. They were monks who had spent years and years in meditation or study, or, so at one point he's making is it's not just to denigrate somebody else's book or something, right? It's for us as meditators that if we start to come to some conclusion, either that emptiness is truly existent, or that other phenomena don't exist, even conventionally, that we're like at the edge of that cliff, right? Or we put one foot over. He's saying step back, in a way. In your own does that make sense? So for your own contemplation, this is an important instruction.
Dr. Lard, so if you look at the timeline itself, just a thought here, correct me if I'm wrong, understanding Nagarjuna on emptiness at that time was a difficult task, even for those people then. And Chandrakirti came in and highlighted a little bit of dependent origination, chariot example and such. So if you look at the period itself, until Chandrakirti came in, we didn't see as much of knowledge around dependent origination. Would that be a right take?
I think it's actually like, so Rajiv's asking a kind of a historical question. Well, actually, in one sense, I guess I'll say, all the Buddhist schools, actually it's an interesting point to think about, because all these different Buddhist schools would say, right, like if you even, like, for example, Vasubandhu wrote extensively on dependent origination, in terms of the 12 links, right, of dependent origination, and it is considered a great scholar, you know, in those areas. But he would assert a position that that a truly existing cause gives rise to a truly existing result, right? So in one sense, he did teach, I mean, they all taught dependent origination. The unique point about Chandrakirti, which follows Buddhapalita and Nagarjuna, really, is that for a cause to give rise to a result, it cannot be truly existent, right? Nagarjuna said that, and then Chandrakirti follows on it. So in one way, they all emphasize dependent origination in different ways. They all taught karma, they all taught the 12 links. But if you look at, like, you know, Nagarjuna's analysis and his texts, they are very, at one point, I'll agree with what you said, they're extremely difficult, right? If you just read Nagarjuna, it's extremely difficult to understand. And that's where, I think I said this once before, for me, I really found it incredible kindness. When His Holiness the Dalai Lama made this point, he said, he was saying, study the works of the 17 Nalanda masters, right? So that's what he's saying. And then he was saying, but if you try it, you'll see it's true, right? If you jump straight to the works of Nagarjuna, then you're likely to misunderstand them, right? And so, actually, it's kind of like, sometimes people say it's like because of lack of merit or something, of beings, or lack of wisdom. You know, so then, because then it came a point where Chandrakirti was needed, right? Because people couldn't understand Nagarjuna correctly without Chandrakirti's work. But then it's saying, but you actually have to be somebody really quite remarkable if you can just read Chandrakirti and therefore correctly understand Nagarjuna. So then he was saying, so it'd be quite useful, he was saying, if you read the works of Lama Tsongkhapa explaining Chandrakirti, then you can go and read Chandrakirti, and you'll understand him more correctly. You know, then if you understand Chandrakirti, you can go and study the works of Nagarjuna, and you'll understand those. So it was almost like this. Now I sometimes think, oh, you need like it's like, I sometimes was laughing, I was thinking that, like you need your Lama to help you understand Lama Tsongkhapa's works. You need Lama Tsongkhapa's works to help you understand Chandrakirti's. Then you need Chandrakirti's works to help you understand Nagarjuna's. And then that person could read Nagarjuna and say, oh, that's so clear, you know. But somebody with more merit, I guess, could just read one word of Nagarjuna. Because there's stories in the Buddhist time, right, where, like, what was the story the Buddha said, I think to, was it Shariputra? That the Buddha just said, I think when the Buddha first met, I think it might have been Shariputra or Mahamogayana, I'm not sure which, but that the Buddha just said, come here. And he directly realized emptiness, you know, because he had some understanding. Oh, here, like, come here means I'm in samsara, he's in nirvana. And then he understood the whole path. Just from those two words, he somehow was able to comprehend the whole path of what it would mean to go, that the Buddha didn't mean come over here, he meant come to where I am, right? And somehow he understood that the Four Noble Truths actually were in the come here, right? That I'm in the truth of suffering, he's in the truth of the cessation of suffering, you know, whatever, there's a cause of suffering, there's a cause to my suffering, there's a path to reach the state that he's in, and this is the nature of that path, and then he realized emptiness, and then he achieved some kind of enlightenment. You know, so that's something, but he had a lot of good karma. We need sometimes more explanation to understand.
Besides, we'll be covering 1100 years of differential there between
Yeah.
and Tsongkhapa.
So I have a question.
Oh, good.
So like I was wondering, like, because you have some time that like that there's a Buddha of speech, and then there's Buddha of mind, and then there's Buddha of body. So does that mean like when you become a Buddha, like you have to become a Buddha between those states, those you have to become a Buddha of those particular parts, like?
Oh no, like the teaching is that they sometimes talk like the Buddha's activities of body, activities of speech, and activities of mind or something, but they say that the Buddha's body, speech, and mind are inseparable.
Yeah.
So if you achieve the Buddha's, if you achieve one, you achieve all of those. That's one way to put it.
So you can teach. You're able to teach.
Yeah, as soon as you're a Buddha, you have the ability to teach limitless beings skillfully, for example. Yeah, it's not like you have to achieve something further. Once you become a Buddha, if you have the Buddha's mind, then you have the ability to do the Buddha's activities of speech, for example,
Yeah.
and body. Yeah.
So well, I mean, because how come people have different personalities, like speech, body, mind? If you have different personalities, so you have to rely upon somebody who's like special in that particular, that has to go with your personalities.
You mean like for a Buddha or
No,
for
a regular person, right? If you have different personalities, so does that mean we need a teacher who has the same personalities as us?
No, I think it just means like you could say you have to have a teacher whose ability to teach suits your personality maybe well enough.
Yeah, yeah.
So that you can listen to them and benefit.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be similar to yours though.
Because if you're towards the mind, if my personality is towards like maybe the body or the mind, that means I need to find a Buddha who's achieved the Buddha with the mind, right?
Oh, but they've all achieved all of them, so you're safe.
No, because sometimes you hear like there's a Buddha of speech who was reborn as a Buddha of speech. It used to be like, why? I mean,
Well, like so, for example, sometimes they say Amitabha is connected with the Buddha's speech. They talk about
Yeah.
But he also has the body and the mind, the Buddha.
yeah. But he doesn't focus on that. He teaches focused on the speech. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Because I'm trying to figure out is it easier for sometimes you go to a teaching and then you meet a teacher and then you just get it, you just understand it, and then you go to another teacher.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that wouldn't be about the body, speech, and mind. I don't think traditionally they wouldn't describe it that way. They would just say that you have sometimes a teacher who you have a karmic connection with, or karmic connection with that teacher, and that then you're able to more that they sometimes talk about that so that you have more connection so that teacher can benefit your mind more, and it's because of your karmic connection to that particular teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's not particularly connected to body, speech, or mind. It's more connected to your karmic connection, I think they usually say. So one person could be a wonderful teacher, but if you don't have a karmic connection, then you just don't feel the benefit sometimes, or it's not. Okay, then the next one. So now he raises a doubt. The doubt that if all non-products not truly exist, this would be in contradiction to the scriptures which teach nirvana to be true. So here he's getting, I'll actually read it and then I'll explain. So he says, if the meaning of compounded phenomena are not, so there's a quote, he's quoting a sutra, right? So he quotes, the meaning of this quote, compounded phenomena are not established, so how could the uncompounded be, was explained earlier. Would this not be in contradiction to the other statements by Nagarjuna? For example, now he quotes the 60 stanzas of reasoning. When the victors, meaning the Buddhas, teach nirvana as the one and only truth, what wise person would think the rest is not the opposite? Then he says, only nirvana is said to be true while everything else is said to be untrue. Then he quotes also Nagarjuna's praise of Dharmadhatu, or praise of spirit reality. All the sutras teaching emptiness were set forth by the victor, meaning the Buddha. These counteract the mental afflictions, but they do not diminish this realm meaning the Dharmadhatu. Right? That is, now Lama Tsongkhapa is talking, that is, the sutras teaching emptiness, the absence of inherent existence, are for the sake of abandoning the mental afflictions. They do not teach that the realm of natural purity does not exist. So you're saying, so he's giving a couple quotes that people, remember, because a minute ago I was saying, there are some people who wrongly assert that emptiness, or nirvana, or dharmadhatu, he's using different words, right, is somehow truly existent, right? And so he found a couple quotes here that those people who assert that perspective would use, right, that seem to suggest, oh, maybe you could view it that way, right? If only nirvana is true and everything else is not true, Maybe nirvana is truly existent and everything else is not. And nothing else really exists, but nirvana truly exists, right? So you see what he's doing there? He chose some quotes that those kind of people who hold that kind of position would choose. And he's saying, if you read these quotes and you have that inclination, you might think that other way. Does that make sense up to that point? Now he's going to explain why they're wrong. Does that make sense? You know that's coming, right? So he says, the response to this, although nirvana is non-deceptive to a mind looking at it with direct perception, it is not a truth that bears analysis. So there is no contradiction with the above scriptural passages. And actually, I'll read the quote. Those who think that way approach the meaning of those statements wrongly. So it's very clear, isn't it? He's saying, if you think that's what those statements mean, you've got it wrong. The meaning of the above statement is that the following is that of the following statement by the Buddha, the victor. So here's the correct quote, a quote that explains those. Monks, this ultimate truth is singular. It is this, nirvana, that which has the quality of non-deceptiveness. All composed things have the quality of being false and deceptive. And I shall read. So the sutra also says that nirvana is true and that composed things are false. The earlier part of the sutra passage very clearly explains that true means non-deceptive. The latter one very clearly explains that false means deceptive. I just want to explain so it might be difficult to understand what he's getting at. There are a few points he's making here. I want to go through them step by step because otherwise I think it can be confusing. Actually, I'll go back. So one point we have to understand when he says nirvana is the one truth, right? I'm going to go back to the earlier quote, right? That's actually Nagarjuna, right? Saying nirvana is the one and only truth. Actually, I won't go through all of this, but there are 4 different meanings of the word nirvana in Buddhist texts. And that one is, Gyume Khyentse called it natural nirvana, which means emptiness. Does that make sense? So that's one meaning of nirvana, and in this particular text, the 60 Stanzas of Reasoning, when he uses the word nirvana in that context, he has this meaning of natural nirvana. So natural nirvana means the emptiness, right? Things are naturally empty. Things are naturally at peace. What they mean by naturally at peace is not that suffering beings are in suffering. It means they're naturally empty of inherent existence. And then also this phrase dharma dhatu, or what does he call it? Sphere of phenomena, a sphere of reality, he calls it. In that context also, dharma dhatu is a synonym for emptiness. So one point is, those 2 lines about nirvana and then about dharma dhatu are talking about emptiness. But now he's going to get into another point, which is, what do those quotes mean? And so what he's saying is this, and we're going to get more into this in a few pages next time, I guess, when we get into the section on conventional truth and ultimate truth. But what he's saying is this, is that, and he actually says it very clearly here, I said earlier I called it the uninterrupted path, right? Which is the path of somebody, the experience, uninterrupted path, I said earlier, right? Is the experience of a person who's directly perceiving emptiness, right? And I said it's like water poured into water. It's a completely direct perception of the ultimate nature of phenomena. What he's saying is that experience, he uses the word non-deceptive. That experience is completely non-deceptive because that person is seeing things, you can say, as they are, with no element of deception to it. And what he's saying is these quotes mean that somebody directly perceiving emptiness is directly perceiving how things are, how they exist. All other experiences, he's saying here, have an element of deception to them. Any experience that's not a direct perception of emptiness has an element in it of being deceptive. And so conventional phenomena, right, which we're going to get into this more, so I don't want to go too deeply into it now, but because we'll go into it in a lot of detail later. But conventionally existent phenomena like tables, chairs, and persons, any experience of such phenomena for somebody who's not a Buddha has an element of deception. I said that last time, didn't I? Because I was saying, like, if you think deeply about it, enough about that, it's quite disturbing, isn't it? Everything, so there's what he's saying really is everything you've ever perceived, if you're not an Arya, some of you may be Arya Bodhisattvas, but if you're not, then everything you've ever perceived has an element of error to it. An element, an erroneous element. Starts to remind me of the Matrix. It's kind of like what he says, right? Everything you've ever perceived has been the Matrix, I'm joking. But has an element of deceptiveness, has an element of error to it. And so what he's saying, so if you look back at the, and that, but that direct perception of emptiness is completely non-deceptive. It's true. And he's saying here true means that. It's true in the sense that it has no element of deception. Everything else has some element of deception. So now if we go back, right? When the victors teach that nirvana, meaning emptiness, is the one and only truth, right? It doesn't mean, he's saying it's the only non-deceptive, right? That experience of, that direct realization of emptiness is the only thing that's true in the sense of non-deceptive, right? And then when it says, what wise person would think that the rest is not the opposite, it means that a wise person understands that all other perceptions contain this element of error, right? So it's not saying they don't exist. It's saying there's an element of error in our experience, unless it's a direct perception of emptiness. Does that make sense? So he's saying that's what that quote means. And then if you look at the next quote, all the sutras teaching emptiness were set forth by the victor to counteract the mental afflictions. This does not diminish this realm, right? So what he's saying is, one is you understand emptiness in order to get rid of your mental, right, to what we were talking about, we were just saying, right, the cessations, right? You're trying to get the cessation of the mental afflictions. That's why you maintain emptiness. But they don't, in other words, they certainly don't diminish the experience. The Dharma Dhatu means the direct perception of emptiness, right? Well, they don't diminish that. They actually lead you to that experience of the truth. Does that make sense? They're not taking away from that. But that doesn't mean, and this is what he says here, that doesn't mean that emptiness is inherently existent. It just means the experience of emptiness, when you experience it directly, is completely non-deceptive. And then we'll get into that, what that means. I'll keep going. So I'm going to reread his quote. The sutra says, nirvana is true, right, and that all composed things are false. Now I'm going to read it again. The early part of the sutra passage very clearly says, true means non-deceptive, right? So it means the experience of emptiness is non-deceptive. The latter one explains clearly that false means deceptive. Now I'll read the next paragraph on page 274. So the commentary to the 60 Stands of Reasoning explains nirvana as an ultimate truth, right? So it's natural nirvana, as I was saying. Nirvana as an ultimate truth, which it is. Therefore, to a mind looking at it with direct perception, it does not have any deceptiveness of appearing inherently established while not being inherently established. To a mind to which the remaining phenomena, composed things, appear directly, they have the deceptiveness of appearing inherently established while not being inherently established. That is why they turn out not to be established as truths that bear analysis when you examine them, with the reasoning that analyzes whether or not they are truly established. Therefore, that is the point of being attached to mere names without thinking deeply about their meaning. Right? So one point is, he's saying, if you think that that quote just means emptiness is truly existent, all the phenomena don't exist, you haven't analyzed correctly, right? He's saying that pretty clearly. But here, do you understand what he's saying? He's saying, what's the element of error in our ordinary in all of our other experiences or perceptions, right? It's that, and it's quite subtle, isn't it? It's that things appear to us as if they were inherently established, as if they existed independently, as if they existed in their own right, as if they existed from their own side. I'm just saying it different ways, right? And yet they don't exist that way. It doesn't mean they don't exist at all, right? But they appear in a way that's not how they exist. They appear in a manner other than how they actually exist, right? And even this is the object of negation we're connecting to, right? In other words, even when you perceive yourself, right? If you check, right, there's this experience. Did I say right? As though it never occurs. It never ever occurs, right? to a person experientially, unless they realize emptiness, that they exist in a manner merely labeled by the mind, right? It seems like, no, I just exist right here, right? This microphone just exists right there. You know, Paul exists right there, right? And and what he's saying is, so it's quite subtle. That doesn't mean Paul doesn't exist, right? But it means that the way in which I perceive Paul always has an element of mistakenness to it, right? And then he's saying, but then for the person, if the person who meditates correctly on emptiness and has a direct perception of emptiness, for them, when they're in that state that I was describing earlier, the uninterrupted path, it's good. It's kind of lucky that it was good that came up today, because now you get the context here. When the person's in that experience of the uninterrupted state, right, of directly perceiving emptiness, like I said, it's like water poured into water. There's no dualistic conceptual appearance for that person. And so for that person, and that's while they're in that state, emptiness doesn't seem to them to exist from its own side or inherently. They don't have any experience like that when they're in that state. And this is the important point. It also gets it. When they arise from that state, remember I said then there's the subsequent attainment after they're in the direct perception? If that person then were to think, like, let's say the next day, if they were to look back and say, yesterday I directly perceived emptiness, right? Now, because they're an Arya, they would know that's not, what's the word, that emptiness is not inherently established. But it would still appear to them as if it was, right? It was still, like, because they're not in a direct perception, as soon as they use language, for example, and have their conceptual mind back, it appears to them as if emptiness is something that's inherently existent that they would know it's not. For us, when we think of emptiness, it appears that way, and we actually grasp it that way, right? As if it actually exists as some kind of a thing. Just like we grasp with a chair as if it exists as some kind of thing. And so this is the element of error. Does that make sense? The element of error, as he's saying, is that for us, when we're having, actually, because we haven't directly, assuming that, if we haven't perceived emptiness directly, everything always appears to us in that way, as if it exists inherently, inherently established, yeah, as if it exists inherently. And so the first time that the person gets like a break from that, or from that false appearance, first time the person has an experience that has no element of error, right, is when they experience the Dharma Dhatu, or natural nirvana, or emptiness, is all synonyms, right? So you see what he's saying there. And so he's saying if you understand that, then you'll be able to understand these quotes. Otherwise, you may misunderstand the meaning of the quote. It's quite profound, isn't it?
So basically, in a nutshell, it's like appearance itself is an affliction, as long as innate I is present. And innate I is always present.
It's actually an interesting question, like you're raising, because I would draw a subtle distinction, I think. This is my own position on that. And I could debate me, I guess, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I could debate this. But my position would be this, is that, and I'll say why if you want, but that the false appearance in and of itself, a false appearance of things as existing inherently, is, the false appearance is not, I don't think that's directly a mental affliction. I think what we call it, that's why we talk about self-grasping. That when we grasp at that as if it's true, that's a mental affliction. So like, in other words, like we first have an appearance, as if, like if a conventional phenomenon appears to us, it appears as if it's inherently established, he says. Right? And then what we do all the time is sometimes they can say assent to, or we agree with, or we grasp at. There are different ways you could translate that appearance, and that's a mental affliction. But just the simple appearance of it is, they would say, is a result of previous ignorance. So it's a result of the mental afflictions, but I think it's not a mental affliction in and of itself. The reason I would say that is, they say, Bhumi's, I said earlier, in your relation to your question, a bodhisattva on the 8th Bhumi no longer has any mental afflictions. Also an arhat, an hinayana, individual liberation arhat, no longer has any mental afflictions. Those are two examples. But when they walk around, they still see things as if they were, when they look at an object, it still appears to them as if it were inherently established, but they don't grasp. They have not the subtlest grasping at that. So they have no mental affliction, but they still have that appearance. And that's the difference between them and a Buddha, is that a Buddha doesn't even have, for a Buddha, things no longer even appear. They get rid of the imprint, they have to eliminate the imprints of ignorance, and therefore things no longer, they appear, but they don't appear inherently established. For a Buddha, things don't appear as if they're inherently existing.
Right.
But anyway, I'm getting kind of a little
But
philosophical.
then, if Dr. Lauren, if you look from a continuum point of view, previous state of consciousness and then the next state of consciousness, the innate I is a subsequent moment of mind, and the appearance happens along the path. So appearance itself becomes an affliction.
Say that again, I'm not sure I understood what you were saying.
So from the mind point of view, right? I mean, the innate I, we're talking about the duality of stuff, you and me here, right? It's also dictated by the previous moment of consciousness, which is afflicted in some way because it's in dualistic nature in terms of being in samsara. So subsequent appearance is actually an affliction. I mean, this is His Holiness talking. Actually.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, in one way, I guess I'll say, in one way, what you're saying, because it was for an ordinary person, we never stop grasping.
Right.
So in one sense, for an ordinary person, what you're saying, I think you could say it's correct. I guess I would say, though, one could, if one is trying to be precise or something, you say, well, the appearance in and of itself can't be a mental affliction because an eighth bhumi bodhisattva still has it. So it has to be the grasping at it.
Yeah.
That's the affliction. That would be a philosophical point, I would say.
Yeah, yeah.
But for an ordinary person, is it meaningful to differentiate those? Because I don't think we ever stop grasping or believing in that appearance. Is it valid?
I can only think from my
Yeah. That's a valid, because we never do stop our assenting. I'll call it. It's
exaggeration.
Yeah, or assenting to the exaggerated appearance, or believing in the exaggerated, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, staying with that, how do we understand, if we start to believe we might have a perception of emptiness, how do we know that, is there a way to distinguish that, oh, I'm just grasping for that in a conventional way, versus actually maybe truly becoming someone more enlightened? Is there a way to, like, does a light go off?
One of the problems with that is, like, in one sense, a light, no, a literal light doesn't go off, of course, but they say, the person who has correctly understood emptiness knows they've correctly understood emptiness, because they've correctly understood emptiness. The problem, of course, is that, I've met people, like one who, sometimes a person who incorrectly understands the emptiness also thinks they've correctly understood emptiness.
I guess that's where I was going with
The
that.
problem isn't, so in one sense, the person who's correctly understood emptiness doesn't have a problem because they've correctly understood emptiness and they know they've understood correctly. The problem arises for the person who's incorrectly understood emptiness because they think they've understood correctly. Is the problem, isn't it? I remember that.
And who's smart enough to actually distinguish between those two people?
I'll just share this. Made me remember this funny story. It was like early on in my, maybe it was like in the early. I'd been Buddhist for a few years at this point, and I was with a geshe who he passed away now a long time ago, but I very much liked him, and we were with somebody who was his student, like more older than me, and was his student, and the person said, Geshe, I think I realized emptiness. And Geshe looked at him. He looked at him. And then the guy said, it was yellow. and Geshe Kenram turned to me and said, what do you think? And I was like, oh, he doesn't want to insult his student. He's like, he put me in the hot seat. It was a kind of gradual discussion to kind of clarify. I think the color was yellow. Anyway, I was like, I never read anything that said that. I guess she was trying to gently help the person. But there are many, right? Even the person Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about, right, who thinks these quotes mean this other thing, they actually obviously had some kind of experience. these are Buddhist philosophers who had some kind of experience, right? And I think there's a couple points that I think are reasonable. One that Lama Tsongkhapa points out in this text, actually. One is, if your understanding of emptiness, right, helps you appreciate dependent origination more. In other words, when you meditate on emptiness and you think you're getting closer, let's say, to understanding emptiness, there are various ways to get it. One point is, if it's bringing you closer to an understanding of dependent origination, that's a good sign. If it's making you more careful about your behavior, karma, ethics, that's a good sign. If, on the other hand, it's making you less careful about ethics, you've misunderstood. Lama Tsongkhapa would say, that's a sign clearly you've misunderstood emptiness. So that's one. Also, if your understanding of emptiness makes you less sort of appreciative of the conventional, and if it doesn't make you more, if it makes your understanding of the conventional less precise or more vague or something, as if the conventional is not really there, or as if it's sort of just nothing, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, that's a bad sign, you've misunderstood emptiness. If, on the other hand, your understanding of emptiness makes you almost like more careful, more precise in your understanding of the conventional, that's a good sign. That you're understanding emptiness correctly. And actually in the, well, I'm looking at, oh no, it's not in this book again. Actually, you have the other book. Well, I'm going to look up a text that gets at this point, that gets at your question. But I mean, Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at it here, but it's also by Lama Tsongkhapa. But then another point I'll make is when you're meditating, it's actually interesting though, because one thing that the Lamas point out, the lineage Lamas, Khenpo Rinpoche's pointed this out too, is when you're actually meditating on emptiness, like one point is also, it's actually, this is really, I'll get through a few more points. One is, you have to emphasize correctly identifying the object of negation, and then through reasoning refuting it, right? So one point is, if that particular session didn't begin with a clear, what's the word, identification of the object of negation, then, and you've just applied reasonings, like, the lack of not being one and many, or, dependent origination, or, the reasonings like a chariot, there's what, 7, I think, points of that. There are all these different reasonings, but one point is, if you haven't correctly identified the object of negation at the beginning, so you can look back and say, well, did I clearly identify the object of negation? If you didn't, then Lama Tsongkhapa uses this phrase somewhere in here. He says, then your understanding of emptiness will have been some vague idea, and you know that's not correct. That's not yet there. You're not there yet, right? That's another way. So we have to, and then also, did I apply, so did I correctly identify the object of negation? Did I then apply the reasonings? And then there should be a point in the meditation where we don't yet have this uninterrupted path, if you're not at that level, but there should be a point where it's like nothing's appearing. But it's not blankness or nothingness. It's that you were so holding on to that object of negation that then when you negate it, it's like, it's an emptiness. Mm-hmm. And that's incorrect, so it should be like that. But then when you arise from that, so there was almost an experience where they say it's like no conventional objects are appearing, because you were holding on to this sense of inherent existence, and then you're refuting it with reasoning, and there's this experience like nothing appearing. That's like an emptiness, right? But then when you arise from that, your experience of, again, having conventional appearances should reinforce your understanding of that emptiness. It shouldn't seem like the opposite of it. This is what he's saying here, right? It should reinforce that. And then I'll just read the last, one more point. This is actually long, and then this is one version of Lama Tsongkhapa. This is Lama Tsongkhapa. I'm reading for a little bit from Lama Tsongkhapa's Three Principal Aspects of the Path, which is a famous, very brief text on Lamrim, actually. Really. It came out of a vision he had of Manjushri, actually. This text is said to be a visionary text he had from Manjushri. I'll start with this. First he says the reason, this is the headline, sound like that. The headline. The reason to meditate on the right view. Without wisdom realizing the ultimate reality, even though you have generated renunciation and bodhicitta, you cannot cut the root of circling in samsara. Therefore, attempt the method to realize dependent arising. Even there, right, he's saying dependent arising. You get that point. Then he says, one who sees the cause and effect of all phenomena of both samsara and nirvana as forever unbetraying, and for whom any object trusted in by the grasping mind has completely disappeared, has at that time entered the path pleasing the Buddhas. Right? So one sees, you see his point here, one sees cause and effect, right? Causal relations, and for whom any object trusted in by the grasping mind has completely disappeared. That's what I was getting about that. You find the object of negation and this experience of no object appearing, right? So it has to be this experience, Lama Tsongkhapa himself is saying, right? Of everything that the mind grasps at as truly existent stops appearing. And yet one understands cause and effect, right? Then he goes on to say further, if the appearance of dependent relations, which is unbetraying, is accepted separately from emptiness, as long as you see them as separate, you have not yet realized the Buddha's intent. That's very profound, isn't it? So as long as you see dependent arising as something separate from emptiness, you have not yet understood the intent of the Buddha. When these two realizations are happening simultaneously, without alternation, and for merely seeing dependent relations as completely unbetraying, the definitive ascertainment comes that destroys the way all objects are apprehended as truly existent. At that time, the analysis of the ultimate view is correct, is complete. Does that make sense? So there he answers your question very clearly, doesn't he? So I'll read that last one again. If these two realizations are happening simultaneously without alternation, right, and for merely seeing dependent relation, which is unbetraying, the definitive ascertainment comes that completely destroys the way all objects are apprehended as if they were truly existent, which we were just talking about. At that time, your analysis of the view is complete. So that's very clear, I think. Lama Tsongkhapa's answer to your question is better than any other. Very clear
And the
answer.
premise would be that you actually can then hold on to that, not just in the moment of meditation, but that you can hold on to it when you step out into the real world.
Well, and that's where, he said earlier in this text, I don't know if you were here that time, but he had a whole section on, what do you call it, illusion-like, the whole metaphor of illusion-like. So that's where he was saying this point about if you correctly understand emptiness in your session, right, then when you go out, get up in your subsequent attainment, so to speak, when you're going around, he makes a point, he says, then things appear in an illusion-like manner. What does illusion-like mean? And he says, that doesn't mean, we went through this a lot, but he goes to this whole point, he says, that doesn't mean things seem insubstantial, or they seem sort of surreal, or trippy, or something. What he says is it means that for that person, because they've understood emptiness in the way he's describing here, appearances arise for them as if they were truly existent, or inherently existent, and yet they know they're not inherently existent. Right, so an illusion-like in the sense that if you are a magician who's at a magic show, right, and you know how the tricks are done, you're like that, right? Like, so you're like a magician at a magic show, right? Who knows how all the tricks are done, right? For that person, there's still the appearance of the trick, but they don't believe, they don't believe the one was sawed in half.
Right. My question was it's always easier, I think, during meditation or in a setting like this to think or feel or meditate or contemplate these things versus getting out into your car, having someone cut you off at the second intersection, and immediately, I guess if you truly have achieved it, that doesn't bother you at all. Because you're actually still in that state of able to say the emptiness does exist, this physical existence does exist, but it's still empty.
Yeah.
Versus if you get upset about it, obviously you don't believe it's empty.
No, and that was what Ken Rinpoche was saying that time, where he was saying, for the person who's had even the sort of correct inferential cognition of emptiness, right? Not directly, but just they've realized emptiness through the power of their own contemplation.
Right.
He says, like he made some analogy, that would be like that. He said, for that person, he actually, what he said, I think the day I was asking about it, he said to me like, that person, if they suddenly win $1 million, or they suddenly lose $1 million, like, their experience is the same. Like, it's no, like, they don't, their emotional would be pretty much the same. Like, so if somebody stole your life savings, or somebody gave you $10 million tomorrow, he was saying, for that person, they'd say, okay, like, they would kind of, it wouldn't really, another way he says it is, he says, it would be, another way you could say that is like, yeah, like, if you had a dream that somebody cut you off, and then you woke up, right? Like, if you ever had that kind of, right, where you wake up and then you go, oh, it was just a dream, that's funny, right? They would experience it like that, right? Like, they would still have the appearance of somebody having cut them off, but if you wake up from the dream, you're like, well, it was just a dream.
Right.
Nobody did anything. I can relax, something that for them it would be like that, yeah. And we want to get closer to that, but you can't. And one point is though, like, is that we can't. Also, you can't. It'd be nice if you could, but you can't really you can't artificially. Actually, because that's like there's a phony thing, right? It's people where we can try to artificially pretend we're feeling that. Like that doesn't really work, does it? I just you wouldn't do that, but I'm saying like we can't. We as Buddhists can do that, where you can kind of like, oh, whatever. But the point here is that it has to come about through our own hard work, which is what you're saying, really. Our hard work of contemplating and meditating and really engaging with the material, and which is like the cooking in a way, right? The cooking of the vegetables in a way. And then, gradually we get closer and closer to that experience, and our mental afflictions gradually get less, even in relation to what you're saying, I was talking to a friend, and there's this teaching that says, like, before the person realizes emptiness directly, when they're on the path, there's like the path of accumulation, the path of preparation, where the person's getting closer and closer to a direct realization of emptiness. And it just struck me because in the teachings it says that when the person's on the path of preparation, they develop like 5, I forget which order they're in, 5 powers and then 5 strengths. And one of the, like, some of those are like the ability to overcome their mental afflictions, through this understanding of emptiness, actually, like was what you're getting at. And one thing I was we were talking about, I was really contemplating, I was like, it was actually in one way, it was good to think about for me. Because I was like, well, that person has this ability, right? They haven't seen emptiness directly yet, but their understanding of it is so deep that when the person cuts them off, they immediately can overcome the mental affliction. Like, they may have a tendency towards mental affliction, like the person, in the dream or something, but immediately they have a power where they can think that's empty. Like, and then it's like they can like swat away the mental affliction. But part of the implication is I was like, oh, so the person who's not yet on the path of preparation doesn't have that power, right? They don't have that power yet. And that we have to develop that power through that's what you're getting at. That the more, each step we take towards understanding, that's a certain state they're described with 5 powers and the 5 strengths or something which are even stronger than the powers or whatever. It's like the mind is getting stronger and stronger, and its ability to use that understanding of emptiness to overcome the mental afflictions. But I think for all of us, I was taking it as a metaphor in a way for an ordinary person who's not yet at that level, but to say, well, all of us, as we progress in understanding, it's like we get a little better at being able to do what you're describing. And that's what we have to keep doing, right?
So you spend less seconds getting agitated about the person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Where is one on a continuum if you're in a meditative state, meditating on emptiness, and you have a hard time transitioning out of it?
You mean like in what way? The hard
You
time?
don't want to leave.
That has never happened to me.
It may sound sort of strange, but
No, that
it's
doesn't sound strange.
easier to get in than to get out.
So why get out?
Well, you have to go on with your life.
How come? I'm joking, pardon. I'm joking. I'm a little bit joking now, but. Yeah, actually, I think that's quite good, isn't it? Like, I mean, in one way, you could say, oh, you don't want to grasp or something, or whatever. But actually, if you just think, I mean, you know, if we're trying, let's say we're in a process of becoming more and more precise in our understanding of emptiness, actually that's quite a good sign, isn't it? Because ordinarily, like, ordinary people, right, what they don't want to get out of is grasping at objects that lead to more samsara, right? Like, if you look at around the world, right, like people want to, I mean, actually, everybody's different. We talked about this in terms of joyous effort one time, right? But like, people want to, what do most people want to stay in, right? For some people, it's like, it's actually all, well, anyways, limitless different things. But for some people, it's hatred, for example, right? Like there are people who just want to spend their time, right, like, in that state. They wouldn't say that. Nobody said, I mean, most people wouldn't say, oh, I want to be hatred, right? But, you know, like, or even like nowadays, right, like people are like doing that with their phone, right? And then they're either, what is that? It's either you're grasping, it's mostly either attachment or anger, right? If you're reading about wherever you are on the political spectrum, if you're reading about politics, you're probably angry. If you're reading about something else, then you're probably attached, most likely. Anything else you're doing is attachment, and then occasionally you go to politics to get angry, and then you go back to attachment. And, you know, so, and then we're just, what is that? Actually, it's a really interesting point, because each instant that the person's doing those things, they're creating the cause of more suffering, right? And we don't realize that necessarily. We don't label it that way sometimes, but each instant you're watching something or engaging with something that's where you're actually like indulging in your mental afflictions, which we all do at times, right? We're actually compounding, they sometimes say, or we're building more samsara, right? And so actually, if a person starts to think, no, I just want to, like, I'd rather stay in meditation on emptiness, that's quite a good sign, isn't it? Like that, because that means the person's more interested in the path to liberation from suffering than they are in the cause of suffering, right? If you think of the Four Noble Truths. So in one way, that would be a good sign, right? That the person's shifting it's actually a sign of renunciation, maybe, right? That the person would rather engage with the cause of liberation from suffering than with the cause of suffering. You know, and if you look at like the lives of the great, you know, the Buddhist practitioners of India and Tibet, for example, and other, like, there's always actually a process like that, right? Where they, I mean, you know, in other words, like, why did I know that was why I made that joke. Like, if you think about it, like, why did so many Buddhist teachers go off to a hut somewhere, or a cave, or whatever? It was because all the other, everything else they could engage with started to seem less interesting, less engaging, less wonderful than emptiness, right? Than meditation on emptiness. You know, and actually, I'll share one last point. You know, I remember this. It just made me think. Just when I said that point about people going off to retreat, I remember this point about Kirti Senja Rinpoche, who was one of my teachers, wonderful teacher. He escaped from Tibet during the diaspora, and then he taught for a little while at school in Dharamsala, and then he went off to a hut in the Himalayas, north of, or I don't know if it's north, but higher than Dharamsala, I guess. Like, you know, so the Dalai Lama, his only Dalai Lama was in Dharamsala, and he just went off to a hut. He had like some hut up in the Himalayas, and he said, like, and I think he said he stayed there for 18 years, meditating on Lamrim, and then Tantra, and emptiness, and so on. And then, I guess, like, after 18 years, his only Dalai Lama sent word and said, you know, come down, you know. And kind of sent him around to teach. You know, asked him for teaching. Actually, I think he asked Kirti Senja Rinpoche for teachings. And I don't know if it wasn't really clear to me if I think Kirti Senja Rinpoche was too humble, and I think he gave the teachings to the Dalai Lama's tutor, who then gave it to the Dalai Lama because he was so humble. But then he went around and taught. And so the only thing that would sort of bring him out was compassion. It was, you know, was his devotion and compassion for others. You know, because in a way, like, you think what would bring, that's why I made the joke, well, you know, why stop? Because, like, actually, like, really from a Buddhist perspective, it's like, well, why would somebody stop meditating on emptiness, which is the cause of freedom, to do the subsequent attainment activities of giving, patience, you know, and so on, right? Ethics, that one has to train in those things, you know. So in one way, it's an interesting point, but I think it's a good sign, actually. right? Because otherwise we're just engaging, if you're not engaging with, unless the answer is bodhicitta, then it's fine. But otherwise, if the answer is anything other than love, compassion, devotion, patience, and so on, then it's like, well, I have the path to nirvana, but I'm going to choose the path to samsara, right? If we leave it for some other, so it's not a good sign that the more we get energized about meditation on emptiness, is a sign that we're interested in the path to liberation. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, any other questions? Because we just have a couple minutes. Should I do one more little section? Let's do one more very brief, it's short sections, I'll do that. So Lama Tsongkhapa now says, establishing the validity of what he just said. So then he quotes again the 60 stanzas on reasoning by Nagarjuna. Conditioned existence and nirvana, neither of these two exists, ultimately, right? We could qualify that. He doesn't say it there, but he means ultimately. Through knowledge of existence, that is what is expressed by nirvana, right? So one point he's making is a beautiful quote by Nagarjuna, right? One point he's making is, whether you're talking about conditioned phenomena, right, things that arise due to causes and conditions, or you're talking about emptiness. In this case, nirvana is natural nirvana, emptiness, right? He's saying neither of those two exist ultimately, right? And what does that mean? It means that if when you're in that state of direct perception of emptiness, there's no false appearance, right? But if we meditate on emptiness, right, and then emptiness seems to be established from its own side inherently, then there's an element of error, right? And you can analyze and say, does emptiness exist that way? Does it exist independently? No, we've already said that, right? It depends upon, right, the emptiness of the chair is dependent upon the chair, and so on. There are many ways to get at that. But so he's saying neither of these two can withstand ultimate analysis, right? Then he says, this is an interesting point, he says, through the knowledge of existence, that is what is, thorough knowledge of existence, that is what is expressed by nirvana. Right, so, in other words, understanding the ultimate nature of samsara is nirvana, right? The Sakya tradition has this, they sometimes call their view, the view of the non-differentiability or something like that, of samsara and nirvana. I think it's getting at a point like this, right? In other words, what is natural nirvana, or what is emptiness? It's the ultimate nature of conventional phenomena, right? So if you think of samsara is made up of all kinds of conventional phenomena. What's its ultimate nature? Natural nirvana, right? Emptiness. So he says, this is an explanation that both existence, meaning samsara, and peace, meaning nirvana, do not inherently exist. And that nirvana is posited as the very object of the knowledge that an inherently established samsara does not exist. So how could this position be a position that asserts emptiness, a non-true existence of psychic existence, as a nihilistic emptiness? Right? You get the point there? Like if somebody says, emptiness is something that's truly existed, and and what is and all of samsara, what's the word, is non-existent in a way. Right? Emptiness is all that's real. Remember we were saying, if somebody misunderstood that earlier quote, emptiness is real and everything else is not real. Right? And one point Nagar is making is the ultimate status of emptiness and of conventional phenomena is the same. They're all empty. Right? That's one point. And then another point he's making is, he says here, right, what is emptiness? It's the ultimate nature of samsara itself, right? And so how could that mean that samsara doesn't exist at all? Like, in other words, it's a qualifier or a description of the nature of what samsara, of how samsara exists. So if that's the case, then how can you say samsara doesn't exist at all? That would mean that emptiness doesn't exist at all. Right? Because what emptiness is the description of the ultimate nature of samsara. It's quite interesting, isn't it? So he's saying, you get the point there. So to say that emptiness is some kind of nihilistic doctrine, if that's your understanding, again, he's just proving through reasoning and scripture, both, that that's an unreasonable, ridiculous position to take. Does that make sense? Well, it's 12:30, so let's do the dedication. Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta, for it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Right, has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.